So carrying on our investigation of how we can position our elements wherever we want them on the page, we're going to move away from floating and look at positioning. So floating has the advantage of being pretty flexible. It will float to the edge of the page however wide the user's screen is, which can often be very useful. Sometimes though you need a bit more precision and you want to know exactly where your elements are. And that's where positioning comes in. So first off, I'm going to get rid of all our floating so that we know where everything is to start with. So we don't need our clear float div anymore. And let's just check that that brings us back to where we were before. Wonderful. So maybe I want to take this green box and move it a little bit to the right. I don't want it quite left of the page. For some reason, I want to indent it a little bit. So there are several ways to do that, but we're going to do that now with positioning. So remember, the first box is our first section here. So first off, we tell the browser that we're going to be positioning this div. And we do that by setting the position to relative. Relative positioning means that we're going to be positioning it relative to where it would otherwise be. So at the moment, if we just take a look at that, that doesn't change anything at all because it is where it was, if you know what I mean. But if we wanted to move it relative to where it currently is, we would then add something like left and then say 200 pixels. And let's have a look and see what effect that has. So that now moves it 200 pixels in the horizontal direction. You might be slightly surprised that we've said left 200 and it's actually moved it to the right, but you could think of it as having almost a 200 pixel margin on the left there, and that's why it's moved to the right. If we wanted to move it to the left, we just do the same thing, but with a negative number of pixels. So let's try moving it to the left, fix 50 pixels. And there you go. You can see we've even moved it off the screen, and we can move it off the screen completely if we want. 500 pixels, you might wonder why we might want to do that. It can actually be quite useful because we might want to slide it in some sort of fancy animation later on, which we'll see how to do in the jQuery chapter. But for now, the main thing is we can move it left and right by having positive or negative numbers there. We can also move it up and down by adding a top property. Again, you can think of this a bit like having a margin at the top. So if we have a 100 pixel margin there, that will move it 100 pixels down. And there we go. So let's just, in fact, we'll have it 100 pixels there. So it's now 100 pixels to the right and 100 pixels down of where it would otherwise be. So this is what this relative positioning is all about. We're positioning it relative to where it was. So quick challenge for you. Can you move the blue box so it's 100 pixels to the right and 100 pixels up of where it is now? 100 pixels to the right, 100 pixels up. Go for it. All right, hope you managed that. All we needed to do was set the position to relative again. And then 100 pixels right means left 100 pixels. And then for 100 pixels up, we're going to use a top of minus 100 pixels. If we used 100 pixels there, that would of course move it 100 pixels down. Let's just check. Wonderful. So it's now gone 100 pixels right and 100 pixels up. And we can use this relative positioning on any element. It doesn't have to be a box, it doesn't have to be a div. We could do it on the paragraph or a table or an image or anything that we wanted to be moved around in some way. Great. So I'm going to show you a different type of positioning in a moment. But first, I just want to move the second section back and just show you how when you've got two elements overlapping like this, you might want to change which one appears in front of the other. So by default, the green box here is in front of the blue one, but if we wanted it to be the other way round, we could change that with a Z index. So Z index works in this way. Set the Z index of any element we like, so whether it be a div or a paragraph or whatever, and then the one with the highest Z index will appear at the front. So if I give this one, let's say, a Z index of 1, and this one a Z index of 2, the second one, i.e. the blue one, should appear in front of the green one. That won't quite work as it is though, because Z index require a position of relative, or there are a couple of other position types that will work, but we've only seen relative so far, so we'll stick with that to work. So let's have a look now. There we go. So now the blue one is in front of the green one. So Z indexes are really handy if you want to have overlapping elements and you want to be very clear as to which is going to be in the front. And you can set the Z index whatever you like. So you could have 100 different values if you had 100 different things overlapping each other, which I probably wouldn't recommend, but you could do it if you wanted. One other little cheeky thing I'm going to show you is really to do with positioning, but while we're talking about layering, it's quite nice. You might want to have an element in the front which is a little bit see-through, so you can actually see the element behind it, and that's pretty easy to achieve. So at the moment, second section is in the front. So if we set the opacity, which is how opaque the object is, an opacity of 1 means that it will be completely solid, as it is now. An opacity of 0 means that it will be completely invisible, and it's there but we can't see it. And an opacity of, say, 0.5 means that it will be there but see-through. So you can choose whatever opacity you like on a scale of 0 to 1, and the bigger the number, the less see-through it is. So that can be really nice, especially if you're working with images, have a sort of slightly faded image behind your text or something like that, however you wanted to do it. All right, so we've had a lot of fun with relative positioning. I'm now going to show you a couple of other types of positioning which can be really useful as well. So if we go back to our default with no positioning at all, I'm going to start with a position of absolute. So instead of relative, we're now talking absolute. And this is now quite different to how we were working before with relative positioning. And let's just see how that affects the page. Aha! The second section has now completely disappeared. Well, it hasn't actually disappeared. What's happened is it's gone behind the first section. So if we change the width of that one to 400, you can see it's actually still there, as is the paragraph underneath, but they're behind it. And that's because absolute positioning then takes the object that you're positioning out of the flow of the page. So basically, all the other elements position themselves as if this green box isn't there at all. So that can be really useful if you want something to be on top of everything else and for everything else to ignore that. And here then, the positioning is relative to the top left of the page. So we can do similar things that we did before. We could move it 500 pixels to the right, and we could move it, say, 200 pixels down. And that would move it around in exactly the same way as we had before. But the main point of absolute positioning is it takes the element out of the flow of the page. So if you want something to position itself over the top of everything else, that's the way to do it. All right, so that's absolute positioning. Take it back to there now. So the last one I want to show you is a position of fixed. Now, how could this be different to the others, you wonder? Well, let's find out. If we have a look at how that looks by itself, it's exactly the same as absolute. So fixed is out of the flow of the page, just like absolute, and we can move it around just like absolute. So how is it different to absolute? Well, we can see this very clearly if, for example, I changed the height of my second section, which is the blue div here, and made it really big. So something like 5,000 pixels. Then we've now got a really long page, and watch what happens if I start to scroll down. Here we go. The green box stays in position. So that's how fixed is different to absolute. Absolute will move when the page is scrolled, fixed will not. So a typical example for a fixed position div might be if you want to have a menu at the top of your page and you want that to appear even as the user scrolls down the page, then you might use a fixed position for that. And there we go. So there's several different types of positioning there. I'll give you a quick summary. Remember, relative positioning means we can move the element relative to where it would otherwise be in the page. Absolute positioning takes the element out of the flow of the page and allows us to move it around relative to the top left of the page. And fixed positioning does the same thing, but it keeps the element fixed even when we scroll down the page. And for all three of those types, we can use left and top to move it left and right and up and down to get it exactly where we want it. We also saw how to use opacity to change how see-through an object is, and Z-index to help make clear which object goes in front when you've got two overlapping ones. Great, so lots of new information there. As always, do have a play around and see what you can make happen with these different positions. We're going to move on to something slightly different, and that is margins.